Ice Café in the 70s when two waitresses found love. The coffee cup shattered against the diner floor at exactly the moment Margaret realized she would risk everything, her job, her reputation, her family's respect, just to feel Susan's hand in hers one more time. It was 1974, and love between two women wasn't just forbidden. It was the kind of secret that could destroy lives, end careers, and leave you utterly alone in a world that refused to understand. Margaret Hayes had been working at Miller's Café for 3 years when Susan Chen walked through that door on a humid June morning. The cafe sat on the corner of 5th and Madison, a small establishment with checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the constant smell of coffee and bacon grease that clung to everything. Margaret had grown comfortable in her routine. The early morning shift, the regular customers who knew their orders by heart, the predictable rhythm of plates and cups and small talk that never went anywhere meaningful. At 28, she had convinced herself that this was enough, that the hollow feeling in her chest was just part of being an adult, that everyone felt this disconnected from their own life. Susan was different from the first moment. She arrived for her interview, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, her black hair pulled back in a practical bun, her smile nervous but genuine. She was 25, recently moved from San Francisco after her father's passing, looking for a fresh start in a city where nobody knew her story. Margaret watched from behind the counter as Mr. Miller interviewed her, watched the way Susan's hands moved when she spoke, the way she listened with her whole body leaning slightly forward, the way her laugh sounded like something fragile and precious. When Mr. Miller hired her on the spot, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, something she had spent years trying to ignore. They worked side by side for weeks before they really talked. The cafe operated like a machine, and they were just two parts of it, moving through their shifts with practiced efficiency. But Margaret found herself watching Susan in stolen glances, the way she handled difficult customers with patience and grace, the way she always made sure the elderly regulars got extra coffee without being asked, the way she hummed softly to herself when she thought no one was listening. Susan caught her looking once, and instead of seeming uncomfortable, she simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Margaret's heart race in a way that terrified her. Their first real conversation happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the lunch rush had ended and they were refilling salt shakers together. Susan mentioned missing the ocean, the sound of waves that had been her constant companion in San Francisco. Margaret, who had never left the Midwest, listened as Susan described the fog rolling over the bay, the smell of salt air, the feeling of standing at the edge of the continent and looking out at infinite possibility. There was something in the way Susan spoke about leaving, about searching for a place where she could be herself, that made Margaret wonder if they were running from the same unnamed thing. The friendship that developed between them was careful and deliberate, like two people building a bridge across a dangerous chasm. They started taking their breaks together, sharing cigarettes behind the cafe, talking about books and movies and dreams they had mostly given up on. Susan loved poetry and would sometimes recite lines from memory, her voice soft and reverent. Margaret, who had always been practical to a fault, found herself buying poetry books for the first time in her life, just so she would have something to discuss with Susan. They talked about everything, except the one thing that hung between them, the recognition that grew stronger with each passing day, the understanding that what they felt was more than friendship and infinitely more dangerous. The turning point came on a September evening when they were closing the cafe together. A storm had rolled in, one of those Midwestern tempests that turned the sky green and sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Mr. Miller had left early, trusting them to lock up, and they found themselves alone as rain hammered against the windows and thunder shook the building. They should have been cleaning tables and preparing for the morning shift, but instead they stood at the window, watching the storm tear through the city. Susan stood so close that Margaret could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could smell the faint scent of her perfume mixed with coffee and vanilla from the kitchen. Margaret didn't remember who moved first. One moment they were watching the storm, and the next Susan's hand was touching hers. Just fingers brushing fingers, the smallest contact that felt like the whole world shifting on its axis. They turned to look at each other, And Margaret saw in Susan's eyes the same fear, the same longing, the same desperate hope that she felt in her own chest. When they kissed, it was gentle and terrified and absolutely right. Like finally breathing after being underwater for too long. The storm raged outside, but inside that small cafe, Margaret felt like she had finally found home. What followed were the most beautiful and terrifying months of Margaret's life. They couldn't be open, couldn't hold hands on the street or go to dinner together like couples did. Their love existed in stolen moments, a touch that lasted too long when passing plates, meaningful glances across the cafe, hushed phone calls late at night when the world was asleep. They found an old park on the edge of town where they could walk together without being recognized, where they could sit on a bench and Susan could rest her head on Margaret's shoulder while they watched the sunset. They created a private language of looks and gestures, ways of saying I love you without words, because the words themselves were too dangerous to speak aloud in public. But secrets have weight, and carrying them grew heavier every day. Margaret watched Susan's smile become more strained as weeks turned to months. She saw the toll it took, pretending to be something they weren't, lying to coworkers who asked about boyfriends and weekend plans, building walls around the most genuine thing in their lives. Margaret's family started pressuring her about marriage, about settling down with a nice man from church, about not wasting her youth in a diner when she should be starting a family. Every dinner with her mother became an interrogation, every family gathering a reminder that she was living a lie that would never be acceptable to the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. The real crisis came when another waitress, Linda, started asking too many questions. She noticed the way Margaret and Susan looked at each other, the way they always volunteered to work the same shifts, the way they seemed to exist in their own private world. Linda's questions were casual at first, almost friendly, but Margaret recognized the dangerous curiosity underneath. In 1974, being suspected of loving another woman could mean losing everything. She had heard stories of women who were fired, evicted, disowned by their families, driven out of town by rumors and hatred. The fear kept Margaret awake at night, wondering if loving Susan was worth the risk of complete destruction. Susan wanted to leave. She talked about California, about cities where people like them could live more openly, where they wouldn't have to hide every moment of affection, where they could build a real life together. She painted pictures with words of a small apartment they could share, of mornings drinking coffee together without fear, of being able to introduce each other as more than just friends. Margaret listened with her heart breaking because she knew what Susan wasn't saying. That staying meant a lifetime of hiding, of stolen moments and constant fear, of never being able to fully love each other the way they deserved. The decision came down to a single moment. Margaret was visiting her parents for Sunday dinner when her father mentioned that the diner owner's son was interested in her, that he was a good man with a steady job, that this could be her chance at a respectable life. Her mother talked about weddings and grandchildren, about the life Margaret was supposed to want. And Margaret sat there nodding and smiling while inside she was screaming, because she knew that this was the crossroads. She could stay, marry a man she didn't love, bury her true self so deep that maybe eventually she would forget it existed. Or she could choose Susan, choose love, choose honesty even if it meant losing everything else. That night, Margaret went to Susan's small apartment for the first time. Susan answered the door in bare feet and a simple sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and Margaret thought she had never seen anything more beautiful. She didn't plan what she was going to say, didn't rehearse the words. She just looked at Susan and said that she wanted to leave, that she wanted to go to California or anywhere else where they could be together, really together, without hiding and lying and being afraid every single day. She said that she didn't care about her job or her family's approval, or what the neighbors would think, because nothing mattered as much as this, as them, as the chance to live honestly even if it was terrifying. Susan cried when Margaret said these things, and then she laughed, and then she pulled Margaret inside and held her like she was afraid to let go. They spent that whole night planning their escape, talking about practical things like money and bus tickets and where they would go, but really they were just holding on to each other and marveling at the courage it took to choose love over safety. Margaret felt afraid and exhilarated, like standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding to jump, trusting that something would catch her on the way down. They gave their notice at the cafe 2 weeks later, telling Mr. Miller they were moving for better opportunities. If he suspected the truth, he never said anything, just shook their hands and wished them well. Linda watched them with suspicious eyes, but by then it didn't matter because they were already leaving. Margaret told her parents she was moving west for a job opportunity. Couldn't meet her mother's eyes when she said goodbye, felt her father's hug like forgiveness. She didn't deserve for a sin she wasn't committing. The hardest part was knowing she might never see them again. That choosing Susan meant possibly choosing exile from everything familiar. They left on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 suitcases each and bus tickets to San Francisco. As the bus pulled away from the station, Margaret watched her city disappear in the rearview mirror and felt, simultaneously, like she was losing everything and gaining the whole world. Susan's hand found hers between the seats, fingers intertwining, and for the first time they didn't have to let go or look around to see who might be watching. It was just a small gesture, holding hands, the kind of thing any couple could do without thinking. But for Margaret and Susan, it was revolution and rebellion and the first moment of genuine freedom. The journey was long and uncertain, and they didn't know what waited for them in California. They didn't know if they would find acceptance or just different kinds of prejudice. Didn't know if they could build the life Susan had imagined or if they would always be outsiders looking for a place to belong. But they had each other, and they had chosen honesty over hiding, love over fear, possibility over the safe prison of pretending. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that refuses to hide, if you understand the courage it takes to be yourself in a world that wants you to be someone else, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Stories like Margaret and Susan's remind us that love has always existed, even when it had to exist in secret, and that choosing authenticity over acceptance is one of the bravest things a person can do. Your support helps these stories reach others who need to know they're not alone, that love in all its forms is worth fighting for. Years later, Margaret would tell people that the best decision she ever made was dropping that coffee cup, was letting it shatter against the cafe floor and admitting to herself that some things in life are worth breaking for. She and Susan built a quiet life in San Francisco, found a community of women like them, created a home filled with poetry and coffee and the sound of ocean waves. Susan had missed so much. They learned that freedom wasn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of truth. That living openly meant facing new challenges, but also experiencing joy they had never imagined possible when they were hiding. Please take a moment to comment below and share what this story meant to you. Or tell us about a time when you chose love over fear. Their story wasn't unique, and that was both the tragedy and the hope of it. Across the country, across the world, there were other Margarets and Susans, other people loving in secret, waiting for the day when their love wouldn't require courage. But every time someone chose honesty, every time someone like Margaret decided that love was worth the risk, the world shifted a little closer to understanding. The cafe where they worked is gone now, replaced by a modern building that serves expensive lattes instead of diner coffee. But somewhere in the archives of that city, in faded photographs and old employment records, there exists evidence that 2 waitresses once worked there side by side, and that their love story mattered just as much as any other, even if the world wasn't ready to celebrate it yet.